You can do it. You want to? No, you can.
Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. So my name is Andrew Predmore. I'm the manager of web operations at the library here at Yale University. I've been working with Drupal for something like 7 years, I think. I actually did a presentation last night to a group in my hometown, and I did the math, and I think I've been doing it for 7 years now. It's staggering. I knew Nancy and her group before I even started at Yale, because I've been coming down to things like this that she had to open to the public. Let's see. As it says on the slide there, this is going to be a pretty fast-paced presentation. This is not a walkthrough, step-by-step kind of presentation, because even though that bullet list looks short, some of the later issues get very deep. And so it's going to be a bit of a fire hose. Do not expect to remember all this. The key to remember is, oh, that's possible. Not necessarily how to do it, but that it is possible. So you may want to take notes about things that are like, oh, I could use that right away. But in general, just get back to me or Nancy or somebody if you say, I remember Andrew talked about this thing. I think it'll do what I need. It would be the best way to approach this. As Nancy said in the registration for this, we're going from the basics, which is the bare bones, never used a web form before, to advanced stuff, to the expert level stuff, depending on how far we get. I want to leave a lot of time for questions. This is an hour and a half. So I did this presentation at Drupal Camp, and I only had 50 minutes, and so I cut it at 40 minutes or so, and I didn't get anywhere near the end of the list. I could get all the way there, but this is also very intimate and casual. So if you have a question, don't wait. Raise your hand and say, if I haven't clarified something, you say, can it do this? You said it could do this. Can it also do that? Go ahead and ask, because I'm here for you. Yes.
I just do something with the questions. Just remember to repeat the question.
If I don't repeat the question, remind me, because that's one part of public speaking I've not mastered yet. Another part I've not mastered yet is that's a good question thing, all that self-effacing stuff. So I'm going to go over the basics first, advanced, and then expert. And we're going to pretty much dive right in. A web form is a content type. At its core, it looks like a Drupal entity, but it is distinctly different in many ways that I'll show you in a second. So content, add content, web form. All right. When you first open up a web form, actually, let me get a little reading. Who here is using Drupal right now, Drupal 6 or Drupal 7? OK, that's good to know. So has anybody here used the web form module before? OK, then we're going to spend a little bit extra time going over the basics so that you don't get completely overwhelmed. Because when I say Drupal entity, you go, OK, because it's obvious that you, in Drupal 7, all the different things that you can create, almost all the things you can create, are called entities. So a user is an entity. A page, for what it's worth, is the thing you would call a page is an entity. A web form is an entity. A comment is an entity. And so they're all entities. And the reason that they're called that and all categorized as that is because there's a huge entity API that allows you to add fields to entities. So if you need a special field on your user or a special field on your comment, then you can add that field. And the forms that are built through the entity API. The whole system works through this entity API, right? And it makes it really, really expandable that you can create new entity types that are completely different. Yes? API is Application Programming Interface. You don't need to know that. It simply means that all the things feed through the same code, so that when I want to create a new entity, I don't have to write new code. I just say make a new entity type. and then I get all of the power of the entities that's already there. I get the ability to add fields. I get the ability to create forms. I get the ability to administer them by roles, and you know, probably 100 other things I get right out of the box through the API. So it's a core piece of code that's extremely flexible, and I know how it will react when I add stuff to it, is the best way to describe it. So a web form initially just looks like anything you'd see in a content management system. Has a title and a body. That's really simple. And that's what most entities start out with. So the body is the part that would show up at the top of your form if you need to add instructional material, instructions, like only fill this out if such and such, you know. So, whatever. Can't think of anything good right now, you know, trying to be too clever. I am logged in as an administrator, and if you have your own account, you probably will be at this level. That can be extremely intimidating when you get these menus. It's kind of like the first time you ever used Word with all the bars open up, or Excel. You've learned probably since then, ignore most of that, right? So there's a bunch of stuff here about adding them in web form to a book outline, creating the revisions, URL paths. Ignore all this. Right.
It looks much easier than HTML.
Yes. Right out of the box, it's easy in HTML. Now, if there are those of you that prefer HTML or want to see why this thing is doing that, you can switch to it, but I don't recommend it. unless you're trying to, yeah, unless you're trying to figure out what went wrong, you don't really need that. So when I save it, this is where it goes away from what, if I were creating a page, I would be brought back to the page and see what I just did. This is where web form goes away from a page. Web form's still here. Right? And that's all there is to it so far. It's got a title and the body. But then in this tab is where the magic starts happening. What you can do with a web form in the outline, again, is you can add elements to the web form. You can add different form elements that you want to use. So let's start with something simple. I want to collect the person's name. Very, very common thing to do. Text field, there's a drop-down here with all the elements that are turned on. These are not necessarily all the elements you get out of YaleSites Basic, you know, the YaleSites Standard, and they're not all the elements that are available. You know, this is a mix and match because I have a fairly heavily customized site. But this is almost exactly the same. I think table element is the only one that's not turned on in YaleSites Core. Right? But there are more elements than this you can get. One thing to point out, I'm going to use a name as a text field. A text field, this is a text field. It is one line. Right? You'll get confused because there's something called a text area also. A text area is a box that has multiple lines. That body form the form that I just type whatever into, that's a text area, which may or may not have a WYSIWYG bar. But it's a big box with multiple lines. And that's it. So for a name, you only want one line. You don't want people, you know, putting line breaks in their name. Right? And we're going to make this mandatory. That means it's required. Drupal is developed by a lot of people all over the world, so sometimes they use words that we would use required. You know, Qualtrics uses required, but Drupal uses mandatory. You know, because somebody looked it up in a thesaurus, probably a non-English speaker. You know, or translated it when they built the module. Okay, when I get to here, right, I get to add advanced stuff to the thing. I've already given it a label. The field key is how the computer stores it in the database. If you'll notice, it says only alphanumeric characters and underscores. Alphanumeric means A through Z, and then 0 through 9, and the underscore. That's it, because that actually turns into the name of the field in the database. Right? And databases are very strict about that. It can be upper or lowercase, but by convention, it's almost always lowercase, separated by underscores. So if I wanted, you know, If I wanted to change this, I could, but it automatically generates one for you. So it's not really necessary. In fact, there might even be modules that hide that from end users. You can set a default value. For instance, if you have an option list and you want people, you assume 90% of people are going to choose the first option. I'm not going into tokens yet because those are advanced. You can set a descriptive text, right? So to help people understand what should go in this field. Hopefully the name field is obvious, but
Trying to get a feel, what is it that you're trying to create?
I'm creating a form that people fill out. Okay, that's a good question.
Survey, not a,
Well, that's
specific.
in Nancy's write-up and in a lot of things I've written, people advertise Webform as a survey tool. Webform is a perfectly acceptable survey tool. It's probably at least as useful as Qualtrics, right? Because it has all the stuff that you can use with Qualtrics, where you can analyze the submissions and get percentages and charts and graphs. You can export the data and all of that. But that's not all it can do. I use Webforms. We use Webforms in many of our workflows for purchase requests or requests for meetings. What Webform was initially designed for wasn't actually a survey tool. It was designed forms that filled out that emailed to somebody, and then that person responded to the person.
And
so
you can keep track of people's responses or what they filled out on the form.
Unlike, when I first started at the library, there was a bunch of forms that were really primitive, what are called Cgi scripts. You would fill out the form in raw HTML. It would hit a Cgi script. That script would turn that into an email and send it off. If for some reason that script broke or the email connection got lost, the submission was gone forever. Right? This saves every submission. So if something goes wrong, and even for an expert level like me, I've had things go wrong in the last year where the email didn't work, or at one point the Yale fell back to a domain name that was over 2 months old, and so it started filling out my dev site instead of my production site. It's okay. I could go look at the submissions that hit my dev site, find them, and port them over to my production site. So things do go wrong, even in the best of circumstances. So we're filling out, we're creating forms, and you don't have to, like you said, no HTML. You don't have to learn input type equals text field. You don't have to learn any of that. Plus, you get all the power for security, and session tracking, and you can block it with users, and many, many other things I will show as we go along. After I do this, maybe I should show you a completed form just to give you an idea of what we're demonstrating. So you have another option to say whether or not it's mandatory. Unique means that every person that fills out this form has to give a different value. Right? So if you were held in a contest and you allowed one submission per email address, you could say, this must be unique. Right? Which you wouldn't want to do this, but if you're requiring their net ID, you could say this, and you only wanted people to respond once, you could make it unique. There's actually a way. You already get their net ID if they're logged in. But so just unique is that option. You can set the width. This width is, you can set the max length. This is the maximum amount that will be stored in the database, which means, and you can leave this blank, and it'll just store enormous globs of text. With text areas, just because I'm completely old school with this stuff and I care about how much space is being taken up, I sometimes set to this like 255, which is 2 to the 8th, if you start counting at 0. But it's not required anymore because the databases can handle different lengths. But if there's any reason where you want people not to go nuts and fill out, because theoretically that in text, even though it's one line, people could dump a lot of stuff in there. And so if you find that's a problem, you can limit it. Width, which looks like max length, width and max length, same thing, right? No, width is how wide it will display on the page. Now, there's a bunch of CSS that tends to make these things wide or short that have nothing to do with this setting, but it will respect if you want a small field for a zip code or a dollar value, right? Because traditionally, when we have small fields where we expect a small number, we tend to make the fields like about 10 characters. The width is set by characters. And then, just as I said, for dollar values, you can put something in front of the field to hint, hey, I need dollars here, right? Or I need percents here, right? So you can give them a hint of what you're looking for beyond the description. Same thing with the postfix. And then where the label displays, you can put it above, you can put it what's called inline, which is next to it in the same div, so that the CSS, it all shows up on the same line. Or you can have no label. You actually end up using that sometimes, and I'll show why. There's been a question that comes up a lot when let me add I'll add a description to a text area. When I get to a text area, let me add a description, and I'll show you a problem that's a known problem. Disabled, right? You can turn this off and just have it send the default value. There are good reasons to do this. I'll explain later. It doesn't seem to make sense, right? Private, this would mean that only people that can see the end submissions can see this field. We use this for things like purchase requests, so people can put in a very simple note, like, I forwarded this to so-and-so, right? Or I have completed this order, right? And that doesn't show up to the end user. It doesn't show up when people see the form, but somebody on the back end can add an extra field to it. So we use that quite a bit. So I'm not going to, in general, when you're scrolling through these, you'll find you'll scroll through these and barely click on any of them, except as you get better, you'll know exactly where, you'll know as you're designing in your head, you'll know which ones you have to turn on and off. So if I go to look at it now, boom. So now I've got a name, and I submit. Okay, so before I go ahead, I want to show you a completed web form so that so I can get give you a broader view. Let's see, what's a nice one that's not overly I don't want to get you complicated ones because they can get really scary.
Can I ask, do Drupal forms interact well with Mac users?
Yeah, they work fine on any browser and any device, and with the responsive designs, they even I've set it up in my theme. They even work down to the width of an iPhone. People can fill these out on iPhones. Yeah, and the YaleSites comes with a responsive design out of the box. So, yeah, these work pretty much anywhere. And anywhere.
A lot of PDFs that if the Mac user doesn't flatten it, when I try to print it, nothing appears in the box.
Yeah, I've always been against filling out PDF or Word documents. I just finished a Google Doc survey that I found frustrating. But there is actually a reason to use Google Docs for complicated stuff. But for simple surveys, use Qualtrics or some other similar tool or a Drupal web form. So this is the West Campus delivery service. In our system, for some historical reason, we don't have a way for people to request books and have them delivered to the West Campus built into our ordering, our normal workflow system. So people that want stuff delivered to the West Campus have to fill this out separately. And so I put in a text field, a text area, right? The delivery address, the zip code, because these actually get shipped by UPS. It's cheaper than running our own van. Email address, phone number, and then the book request, the title, author, call number, and notes. And we just pray that they actually get that information correct. In normal workflow, this comes from our catalog, and we know exactly what they want. Here, we have to sometimes do detective work. Luckily, this form gets filled out a few times a year, so it's not a big problem. So you also notice that I've got these gray lines around around sections. Those are called, what are those called?
God, I was just replying to that. Groups, field groups.
Field groups, or yeah, there's
Field sets.
Field sets. Yeah, field groups are a whole different thing that we're not going to get into.
Right.
Yeah, that's why I blanked too, because there's two different things. These are called field sets, and they're built into HTML. And these can be expanded and shrunk either by you or by the end user, which can be very useful on long forms like our purchase request form. So this one is protected by the login. Why am I? Why didn't I go to cast automatically?
I don't know. I don't know. I think it needs to be set up differently.
Okay.
That's a whole nother presentation.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to.
But I
I'm gonna
can
have to
show
look
you
at that.
later.
Well, I need to have that fixed because
Yep.
that's a live site.
I needed it.
Yeah. Well, no, people have been filling it out, so I don't know what's going on. We'll get into that later. Or actually, I can look at it this way, can't I? I can look at it on the dev site, and I'm already logged in. Purchase requests. Okay. So here there are three text. What do we just call them? Field sets. There are three field. I don't know why. I'm so tired. There are three field sets, and because they take up so much room, we've given people the option to collapse them as they're going through and expand them as they're going through. I doubt if anybody ever uses that, but it's there if you need it. So let's look at some elements in this much more complicated form. Before I look at the elements, I'll point them out here before we look at them. So you can do what are called radio buttons, just like an old-fashioned, well, even modern car radio. You can only choose one station at a time. You press the button for you press button 2 and you get, your NPR station. You press button 3 and you get, 92.5. You can't have both on at the same time. Those are radio buttons. So you get choice of radio buttons. You saw drop-down lists earlier. Text areas. Emails are actually separate input types. They're displayed as text area, but they have extra validation to make sure it's a real email. Telephone numbers. Here's a drop. This is the drop-down. Here's a drop-down. And so on and so forth. Price. Because I'm using Chrome, it has this little widget, which is, in this case, is completely useless. But because this is an input type called a number, and because Chrome is trying to be clever, it actually adds that. It could be useful if they're picking from a limited range, but this doesn't come from Drupal. This comes from Chrome, because we told that the input type was number. And then we have some text areas down here and internal notes. I can see these internal notes because I'm logged in, and I'm logged in as a person that has permission to see them. Normally, most people filling it out wouldn't. Now, what has been a problem with a lot of people, and this is not YaleSites or anything, this is a big Drupal issue, is the description of what the field is for ends up below the actual input. That's fine when it's something small, and I don't even have, if you were a text area and the description was down here, that'd be fine. But when it's at the bottom of a long list, it can be a nuisance. And there is a way around that, which I've done multiple times, that takes a little extra work. But believe me, if you start making web forms for people, this is one of the first things they're going to say is, why is that description so far away from the label? All right, so we'll look at that on this form while we're at it. And then I'm going to show you a couple elements in that trick, and then I'm going to move faster forward. But again, I'm going through the basics because you guys haven't seen any of this before. So this is all of the form on the back end. You see that my field set has items inside of it, like select options, text fields, email, and there should be a markup. And this one, I must be running where's the number? Oh, there, and a number. So, and you'll see these little bars. These are nested inside of the field set. When you create a field set, you don't get most of those options because field sets don't actually store any data. They're just structural elements. But you can put things inside of them, and you get these cute little bars here so that if I want to move this from one field set to another, that's all I do. If I want to move it out of I just go to the left, and then it'll break out of the field set. And so when you create your field set, then you create your other elements, then you drag them in through this neat little interface, and bada boom, bada bing. You know, again, no learning markup, not anything like that. The value listed here is the default value. Most of these do not have a default value, right? and then whether or not it's mandatory. That can so this, one thing about this, and this is for all of Drupal, when I drag that, you notice it turned yellow, and then it put this warning up on top. Changes made in this table will not be saved until the form is submitted. In lots and lots of the modern Web 2.0 plus tools, when you move something around like that with an Ajaxy widget, it saves the change automatically. Drupal wants people to be much more deliberate about it, but they've had a lot of trouble with people moving stuff around and then going and looking at the form and saying, where did my changes go? Right? So in lots of places, if you see that yellow show up, remember to hit save, or the change you just made, the rearranging you just did, will not happen. Right? And that happens not only in web forms, it happens in menus and all kinds of other places in Drupal. And so they try to compromise. They want the hardcore people want to move it around and think about what they're doing and then hit save when they're ready. But the inexperienced users need these big warnings, because they're expecting different, or the newer users are expecting much more dynamic interface. So what should I say? Select options. Select options are interesting. Do I have a whiteboard I can get to?
Over there.
Yeah. Select options are where you can select things from a limited list of things. And in HTML, there are 3 or 4 types. But in Drupal, there's only one type, and you create which one you want based on the options in select options. So, and let's look at the options, because I haven't drawn this grid in a long time. I used to draw it all the time. So what you can do is say, do you allow multiple? Do you want it in a list box? Right? And so, and what is the third one? Well, let's write those down and I'll figure it out. So if you allow multiple, this is this axis. Actually, there's only 2 things. Yes? No. Do you want it in a list box? Yes? No. Right? If you allow multiple and you want it in a list box, you will get that square box where you can control-click on multiple items. So you'll get a multiple drop-down. And this, I don't even know, is documented anywhere. I should probably add it to the Drupal docs. If you do not, if you say, I want multiple, but I don't want it in a list box, then you will get checkboxes. Right? So you'll get a list of checkboxes, and you can choose more than one, multiple. Right? If you do not want them to choose multiple, but you want it in a list box, then you get a traditional drop-down. And last but not least, anybody guess what the last one is? I talked about it earlier. If you do not want them to choose multiple and you don't want to use a list box, you end up with a radio buttons. Right? So even though these generate different HTML, they are all the same element as far as Drupal is concerned. They're all select options because you're selecting from a limited list of options. So they're, I should really draw that chart and document it, because I don't think that documentation is even on Drupal.org, that matrix. So you'll notice here, I am requesting this item because, and then I said, don't allow multiple and don't show it in a list box. So I ended up with radio buttons. The options themselves, where are the options? I'm scrolling by them. You can just type in the label here. I want this because Yale does not own this item, or the item is lost or missing. Right? You could type in the label, and then Drupal will create the actual storage of the value for you. If you need something very specific, like a building code behind the label, or you need a financial, accounting code behind the label, you can go over here and turn off that fancy thing and go to manual entry, right? And what happens here is the value that is stored is not underscored owned. You've seen this syntax before, right? It's alphanumeric. And then there's a bar and then the label. And this is lost underscore missing and a bar and the label. Right? So if you need to have the label be Sterling Memorial Library, but the code be SML or some other building code, you can go into the advanced settings and do that in a select, in any type of these selects. Before I started with YaleSites, I never actually even had that turned on, because I've always hard-coded it. So that creates my list box. And let's look at one or two more, and then, and then move on. Okay. Email address is the label. The auto-generated the field is e_mail address. User emails default. If they are logged in, then it will automatically grab their email from the CAS LDAP. And when you click on that, this goes gray and adds this token saying the default value is the current user email. This is one place where you might want to disable the box and not allow them to change it, right? Because then it'll fill it on automatically as their current user email, and they won't be able to add their Gmail address or something like that. So this is an example where the disabling is actually useful. Why would you disable an input? Well, because you know who they are, and you don't want them to change it. Right? This is required, not unique. I set the display width for 42. That's a CSS thing that nobody needs to worry about. And so the thing about an email is, as I said before, it's still a text field as far as HTML is concerned, but it actually validates whether or not it's a real email address. Right? So if somebody puts in, foo.com and no @ and nothing before the @ it'll be like, that's not a valid email address. Right? And it supports the entire RFC standard of email addresses. So if they have weird things like an IP address instead of a domain name, or they're using IPv6, or they're using or even old gateway email addresses, it'll support all of those. So I've never seen an email fail, even the really, really weird email addresses that still exist on the internet, or exist on the internet. And then, so you can add an email address, and then let's look at the number here. So number can be very useful. Again, it'll show up as a text area, or actually it can show up as multiple things. You could make a select box with a limited set of numbers in them, right? But this is for filling out any number, but there's a bunch of extra settings, right? You can set the minimum, right? Since I'm asking for the price, I don't want them priced below 0, because that doesn't make any sense, right? You could set a maximum if you have a reason to do so. This is useful if you're asking for percentages. Okay, minimum is 0, maximum is 100. We're not giving 110% here. The step, that little button thing that we saw, you can say it to increment in larger steps. So when you hit that little button, it'll go up 5 or 10 instead of 1. I haven't had any use for that, but it's there. And here's where you can say, show it as a text field, or if you've made a limited thing where you have a limited range and a step, you could show it as a select list, if people can choose, 0, 5, 10, 15, 20. And that. The same thing with the prefix and the suffix. Number of decimal places, right? Which, again, for prices makes sense. You only want 2 decimal places. 1,000 separator and decimal point. You just want to check these. YaleSites should have these set up with American Standard. But if any of you have lived or worked with the Europeans, you know that it's exact reverse in Europe, that Europeans use a point for their 1,000 separator and a comma for the decimal separator. So if you have any reason to flip it, because you have an almost purely European audience, you can do that. For the analysis, you exclude 0, which will exclude 0 from your averages and things like that if you're running an analysis on something. Right, so it'll exclude them from your averages and from your other aggregate numbers. So that's an example of a number. There are many more which I will go to further down. Any questions so far? Comments, places, things you saw that I just breezed right over, or things that didn't make any sense yet? Okay, let me know. I tend to bounce around a bit. Okay, so great. I've got these submissions, and what do I do next? Well, almost always you want to email the submissions as they come in, one at a time. Maybe not in a survey, but in the workflows I've used, even in surveys, we tend to have them float in one at a time. And so there's ways to email them. You can send multiple emails to different people that have different content in them, and you can send emails based on different triggers, which I'll get into later. So you can send an email to one person based on one thing, and an email to a different person based on a different thing, which actually is represented here. So whenever, as the admin, whenever I create a web form, first thing I do is I send an email to myself. Right? Every single form email that gets filled out on my website goes to me. Right? Because when things go wrong, like I described earlier, I'm the one that has to clean it up, and so I need to have a copy of that email. Now, I have a policy because we do deal with personal information. The library circulation is considered personal information. We're not supposed to know what people checked out or care. I do have a policy of deleting these once a year, anything that's over a year old. So you do have to be careful if you're ever dealing with sensitive information, in HIPAA information or financial information, that if you are, as an admin, are getting copies, that you are being responsible about your curation of that information. But I send everyone to me, and the way I do it is I just hard code in an address here. I hard code in my email, and then I hit add. And when I get to here, I'm sending to a hard-coded email address. I use the default subject so I can filter in Outlook, because I get literally, and during the semester I would get 100 of these a day. And so I add the default subject, but you could change the subject, congratulations, or thank you, or whatever. Or you could even change the subject based on something they filled out. So if you want a contact form that is name, subject, right, and they fill out the subject, you could make that the subject of your email. The from address, in this case, the from address is from the person that submitted, right? So that if I, for any reason, want to reply to this, I will be replying to the person that submitted. If I leave it as the default for the entire domain, if I reply to this, I'd basically be replying to myself. Right? And then the from name, since this has a name field, I include the from name. You could make it, on some of these where we don't ask for a name, you could just make it something generic like submitter or selector or something like that. Requestor, I've used all of those. The templating, and this is where I'll dive into tokens very briefly. You can add all of the stuff that came in it was submitted to the form, the values that were submitted to the form, and you can get other things that were recorded when the submission happened. You can get the submission date, you can get the user, right, their net ID, you can get their the URL back to the submission itself, right, and many, many others, way too many to even go into. I mean, way too many to go into. You get an idea of how many. I mean, you can, in general, you don't have to use these, but you can customize this. And tokens are incredibly powerful and used all over Drupal. But in general, you don't have to use, these are the defaults that they give you out of the place. The only thing I do is add some extra white space in between each line, because these things come out as plain text, and they're often very hard to read. But the other thing is you can also say what should or shouldn't be included in this large. This shows all the values, all the labels and all the values that were submitted. And you can say, don't show me certain things. Do or don't show them. By default, all of them are turned on. But for instance, yeah, you may not want to show that. You may not want to show the internal notes when the email gets sent. If they're submitting an essay contest and writing 500 or 1,000 words, you may not want that in the email. You may want to go back and look at the submission. So you can turn those on and off. And then save it, and that will get sent. Yeah. I hate that. There's something wrong with the breadcrumbs, and you do it that way. So then you can send, which is almost always the case, you can also send a separate email to the email address they filled out, right, saying, thank you for submitting this, right, or that we acknowledge that you submitted a copy of this. And then the same subject, but this time it comes from me, because if they want to reply to it, they reply to me. It would be better if there was a general purchase request selector email address that they reply to instead of me, but we don't have that set up yet. And the template's pretty much the same. One thing that does cause confusion, if the form requires you to be logged in when you see the form, then they will be able to see their submission, right? Because a person that submits a form will be able to go back and look at their submission on the web. If it does not require that login, then it becomes a mixed bag. If the person was logged in, they'll be able to see their submission. If they weren't, they won't be able to see their submission because they are just logged as anonymous. And when they come back, they don't know who you are. So they can't show you all the anonymous submissions because that would be a violation of privacy. But they can't figure out which one is yours either, right? Yes? Mm-hmm.
In that case you're describing, so if I logged in with my ID
Mm-hmm.
and I submitted a form,
Mm-hmm.
and I needed to go back and revise it, so
Mm-hmm.
a different type of form, then I'm not just submitting to place an order.
Mm-hmm.
It's another form, maybe a continuous type of form,
Mm-hmm.
2 parts or 2 sections.
Mm-hmm.
And once I submit it,
Mm-hmm.
is there something that's called a unique form ID? Is that one of the tokens?
The web form has a node ID. Entities used to be called nodes. And then each submission has a submission ID. Yes. Mm-hmm.
All right. Somebody's been working on a form right now for us that's having something called a unique form ID, so that somebody can use that particular ID to come back in to make changes if need be. So it's going to go off to somebody else to look at, come back.
Okay. That leads me right to a discussion, a segue. When web forms are not the right answer. One of the key places that web forms are not the right answer is when you have a workflow. If you have a thing where person fills out form, one person checks it, modifies it, it gets sent to another person, that person does something, does some work and then checks, I have completed the work, and then goes somewhere else, not a web form. Web forms do not do that, and they should not be twisted around and bent until they do that. There are probably enough modules out there, and using things like rules and actions and triggers and all the other modules, there's probably a way to do it, but that is not the purpose of a web form. So if you have a workflow, you need to use a workflow tool, either a Drupal workbench tool or something built into ServiceNow or something like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Or in this case, would that be somebody that's calling it a form because that's something that we maybe had it as a form, but
Yeah.
we're only trying to accommodate us, so it's really truly not a web form.
It should not. Yeah, the Drupal web form module can do multiple page things, but it cannot. Well, it can, but it never should be twisted into a workflow. Right? If you have a workflow that requires, step by step, multiple people interacting with it or branching based on decisions that are made along the way, web forms are not the right thing to use.
So this is the terminology used here. And it's just fine.
Yeah, and then because a form is actually an HTML element, open tag form. So yeah, when people use the word form, they could be referring to a lot of different things. The Drupal web form module, spelled one word, actually it's not even usually capitalized on the F, is a specific thing, right? And so ask beforehand if what are you talking about Drupal web form? No space web form module, or are you just talking about a form that you're going to build in some tool? So that's another. And since I'm here, when web forms are not the right answer, the only other one I can think of, I think there were 3, but I've forgotten the second one. Another place where web forms are absolutely not the right answer, and this is actually in your terms of use in YaleSites, is web forms are not the right answer if you're collecting any personal identifiable information. right? And since most of you guys are tech people, you know what that means. That means credit card numbers, social security numbers, health data, et cetera. Okay? Yes?
That, just so you know, that is not allowed for
Any
Yale
part
site,
of YaleSite.
period.
Yeah. And so if you are asking for any of that information, you should not be using YaleSites. Right? So they are working, the strategy team is working on some sort of credit card processing tool that will be approved, but it is probably a year out at least. So don't do it. It's simply, I've personally gone all the way to writing credit card gateway software for clients, and I will never, ever do that again. It is a nightmare to maintain and keep stable and secure, and it opens you up to so much liability that it is not worth it for any cost. I will never, ever do that again. Whenever somebody says, we need to process payments, I say, PayPal or Google Checkout. We'll collect all your information, but as soon as you put a credit card number in, you're not on my site. And it works just fine. So that's a segue to, I usually go to that one halfway through the advanced, but since you brought it up, there are two places, at least two places where you don't use Webforms. They are not workflows. And even though it is possible to twist them into them, it's not the right tool. And do not ever collect any personal identifier. Lots of people, the last time I saw this demonstrated by YaleSites, people were doing registration for events. Yeah, you can register for events, but don't ask them to pay for it. Right? And don't ask them to pay for it on this form. So again, it's more than just surveys. So where was I? Okay, so we went over sending emails. Well, let's go over contextual. So when, where did I didn't show you in detail because I wasn't ready for it. On this form, this is one of the ways to send an email based on what they filled in. There are several ways to send an email to different people based on what they filled in. This is the simplest one. Right? Subject area. Right? So it says choose the closest possible subject area for your request, right? And then choose from these different categories. Is it part of arts or architecture? Is it classics? Is it divinity? Is it related to divinity? There's still some craft. Our organizational structure shows through here. It probably should say religion instead of divinity, but you get the idea. It used to actually list the names of the libraries, which was useless to an end user, but there's still some cruft left. Now, this purchase request will get sent to a different selector in our library based on which one of these they clicked. The easiest way to do that is that neat little trick I showed you before. The values that are hidden behind here, under arts and architecture, it goes to Holly Hathaway, who's the head of the arts area, head of the art library, not the arts area library. Colin McCaffrey's the head of our classics, et cetera. Lucille Hood, right, is in charge, is pretty high up in the acquisitions, and she gets the general category. And she's the one that requested this form and tends to administer the submissions and things like that. And so she's also the default value because half the time people don't pick something even when it's completely obvious. They're ordering a book on Christianity in the 20th century and they still leave it in general. It's just like so what we do, so we have these and the values are hidden behind there. Important note, these values will show up when you view the source of the page. Okay? So if I look at this and I go view source, right, and then all the other junk here, I'm still in the header, somewhere down here, now I'm in the menus. These sites get really complex. Here we go. So I'm almost in the right place. Pickup information, priority, subject area. Okay. Where is it? Okay, so right there, value holly.hathaway@yale.edu. So anybody that loads this page, this is behind cats, but it loads this page, will get this email address. this is not a major security issue, right? We publish our email addresses on the Yale directory, so any spammer already can get hold of them. But it is something to keep in mind if somebody discovers this. Why is my email address, available publicly on a web page? Well, because you work at Yale and your email address is supposed to be public. I mean, that's the fact of it. Your name's in the directory. You're supposed to be contactable, right? So, but just be aware of it in case somebody says something about it. There are other ways, but they're much more complicated to hide that stuff, and I don't consider it to be valuable enough. My email address has been out there over a decade. The same email address for over a decade. I use Gmail. It has an excellent spam filter. I get many, many more spam than I get real email, and I never see them. So, just that's what you have to do. You can't hide your email address from the world. You just have to hope your spam filter holds up. So anyways, when I do, yes?
Just a question about that option.
Yeah?
How do you know, what order to put those?
When you put them in line by line, that will be the order they show up in. So if you want to alphabetize it, you have to do it by hand, if that's what you're asking.
I'm just wondering, how would I know that the email address comes before the bar instead of, flipped around?
If you forget, ask. Actually, wait. Let's look again, because I think it does describe it. Let's look again before I get. So if I hit manual entry, okay. Yeah, here. There is directions. List options, one option per line. Key value pairs may be specified. See each option with pipes such as key and then value, which, again, doesn't help you because those are technical terms. But the value, actually, that's...
The label. The value is the label. The key.
Yeah, the key is the thing that will be stored. The value is the label, right? Which, unfortunately, is bad writing, because if you look at this, the label of this column is value, but it's actually showing you the keys. So we've got some terminology confusion right there that needs to be fixed in the interface. This is Drupal core, so we'd have to file a feature request. But yeah, so basically, ask us if you forget. Or you could auto-generate these and then notice. So if you type in the label using that thing and then go to manual entry, you'll notice, oh, this is human readable, this is computer readable, because it will automatically generate the one with the underscores and the alphanumeric, and it'll create the pipe. So if you add a couple of them and then hit manual entry, then you'll notice which is which. Yeah, so, but that's a really good question. Because, again, I've been doing web forms for so long, I do these in my sleep. I can bang these out in 5 minutes. I can sit in a meeting and say, what do you want on the form, and fill it out while we are talking. And by the end of the meeting, we have a working web form. That's how fast I can do these things. So I forget that, some people don't don't swim in this ocean all day long. OK, so now let's go to the emails, because that's the last one. So the value of subject area. So the email, I tell it to send to the component labeled subject area, right? And it will find that email address, and then it will send to that person. This is the simplest way to have conditional emails going to different people, by letting the end user choose which thing. One thing as far as usability, do not require that the end user has internal knowledge about your structure. That's why I removed, they used to list the library building names, and I changed it to the subjects that each building more or less covered, because it's not obvious. What's the best example? It's not obvious when you go to this form. When you go to this, I mean, I don't even remember where humanities was listed. I think that was Bass Library or something, and that made no sense whatsoever, because Bass is actually a general collection. So it wasn't. It required the end user to have internal knowledge of, and so never require the user. One thing I hate is a button that says, give us feedback or click help, and then it says, choose which category of help you need. No, I want help. You're supposed to do the work for me now. As soon as I click that button, you're supposed to work, and I'm not supposed to say, is this a Drupal problem, or is this a, libcal problem, or a Qualtrics problem? I don't know what those things are, right? I just want help. So never force your user to know stuff, have internal knowledge, right, when you're building these kind of things. And that's why I changed. This used to be choose the building. And people would be like, well, I want it delivered to this building. But what we were really asking is choose the subject area, because that's the person that's going to have to process this request. So I changed that in the last round. And then they will send the emails. OK, so there's one more field on the basic stuff. Actually, there's two more fields. There's the, we're not going to conditionals. There's the form settings here, and then we will get to what you've all been waiting for is the results. Wow, I have been going too slow. I'm already an hour in. Yeah, well, again, I'm keen towards the audience. This is, yeah. I like to show off the really cool stuff, though. I never get to it. So, well, we'll jump around. Maybe I will jump around a little bit. Or I'll go a lot faster after I get this done. And again, just say, you can do this. I'm not going to explain how. So for some reason, this is stretching wide. I don't know why. Drupal's usually better about that. So I just clicked on form settings. And in here are some under-the-hood stuff that you do need to look. Confirmation message. You should always have a confirmation message. Right? Now, there are a couple options. You can write the message right here, which is generally the best thing to do. Right? You could also redirect to another page if you have a very long message that you're maintaining separately and you want people to find separately. Right? You go to a policy page or something like that. But normally, I mean, I've, again, been doing this for years, and it's so, I generically just say, thank you for submission. Somebody will contact you shortly. I type that in, and nobody ever changes it. You know? Because that's more or less, they just want, when you're filling out a form and you click that send button, even the page refresh, you just want to know it worked. You know, you want that little green message that says, I acknowledge that you just did something. You know, I'm not going to make any further promises as to whether or not a human being will respond to you, you know, but I'm going to acknowledge that something happened when you click save. Right? So that again, for usability, that's important. So then the location, you can go to a confirmation page. This will, when you submit it, is this in the purchase request? I go to a confirmation page? Huh. OK. I guess that makes sense, because I don't want them submitting over and over again. We've had trouble with that. The Magic department tried to order like 50 books. The Magic Club tried to order 50 books one day. It was hilarious. I thought we'd been hacked. There was like 5 of them sitting in a lab, all filling it out at the same time. Anyway, kids, what are you going to do? So you can go to a confirmation page. All that means is that it will land on a blank page with your message. And it's going to be a very short page because that message is one line, right? You can go to a custom URL. Like you said, you could go to another page on your Drupal site. You could even bounce them off to some other site completely if you have a reason to do that. Again, for things like contests or things like that, you may want to have a contest rules or policy page. Or in a commercial world, if I had somebody fill out a contest, then I'm going to bounce them right to some sort of marketing pitch where now that you've filled out the contest, buy our product, so that's where that would be used. Or no redirect, reload the current page. Now this is the generic purchase request form that anybody that has a CAS ID can fill out and ask for a resource, ask us to buy something for their use, and therefore, I go to a blank page. If they want to add another purchase request, I make them do the extra step of going back or finding the link again so that they don't go nuts. Now, our internal selectors might fill out a different form, the e-resource, like asking for databases and stuff. They might fill it out over and over again, but these are responsible people. I know what they're going to do. Then I can just go back to this one here, no redirect, reload current page. Right? So it'll reload the page, and it'll put the message at top. Right? So if you have a form that you think people are going to be filling out over and over again, and that's OK, then you can just redirect to the form and put the message at the top. Right?
Thank you for your submission.
Yeah, it'll still say the thank you for the submission at the top, but it'll actually reload the form so that if they need to fill it in again, they can do that. So then there are many use cases where people will need to fill the form in over and over again. Again, this gets into the whole think about what you need before you start building these. One of the great things is that these can be changed on the fly. Total submission limit, I did have to set this up. So you can limit the total submissions for everybody, right, So if you have a contest and you're only giving away 100 tickets, you know, you only want 100 people to enter, you could listen. You could do it total submissions ever, or you could limit it if you're a radio station and you know, every hour you announce the type this code in and you'll be entered to win. You know, first 100 people in the next that fill it out in the next hour. You know, well then you say you only allow 100 submissions an hour, right? So you can set all kinds of limits there. And then per user submission limit, this is what we had to do with that group. After that group asked for 50 books in one day. And we also have one person who will remain nameless that asked for way too many books. I mean, way too many. There's one person that thinks it's their personal Amazon account. And so we say, you get to ask for 5 books a day. If you need more, and there's, in the body of this one at the top, it says, this form only allows you 5 books a day. If you need more, talk to Lucille Hood directly. And since that, then we've had no problem. I mean, most people, except for that one user, I've never seen anybody, and those 2 cases I just described, I've never seen anybody request more than 5 books at a time. You can open and close forms. Really great, because we have a bunch of awards that we give out every spring for student essays. Right, there's grants that offer an award every year, and then those are given out during the college, the pre-commencement events. They're announced in each individual college the day before commencement, in that big event they have there. And so I'm going to have the same form every year. The kid has to submit their name and their title of their thing and upload a PDF, and then when the contest is over, I just close it. Page is still there, links still work, but it just says, the body says the deadline is April 9th, 2013. And as soon as I close it, all the form elements disappear, but the body's still there. It says, the deadline's April 9th, 2013. And I hope our students are smart enough to realize that means you can't fill this out now. Wait till next year. And so I can close it, and I don't have to recreate the form every year. So I've got like 3 forms that do this, that I close every year. I've actually thought about writing something that does it for me automatically, which would be kind of cool. Another thing I've been thinking about writing for similar reasons is something that deletes the entries after a year, so that for the privacy reasons. So those are 2 add-on modules I thought about writing, you know, in my infinite free time. So I've been talking about people that have to be CAS authenticated to see this. You can set the roles that are allowed to fill out this form, right? When you get a Yale site, you get these 2 are Drupal core roles. You cannot delete them. They exist in every Drupal site that's ever existed. And then these 2 are, actually these 3, this is also a Drupal core role. Is it the admin module, or is that rolled into 7? Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's a core role also. And then these 2 are provided by YaleSites, right? So these roles, I've added some other ones because I want people, and you see they actually have to do with this. I've added some roles so that I don't want to give a selector permission to edit my entire site. They really don't need to, right? A person that's a selector, by the way, I've been using that term a lot, is the person that gets these kind of requests and then selects the books in their subject specialty that we will buy in the next year. So they're a selector, right? And so they take these open requests, and they also look at new publications and decide which ones we're going to buy and which ones we're not. So that's a selector. But I don't want, most of those people do not, I don't need them running around my site, and they really don't want to. So I created a role that says, Webform Results Viewer, and those selectors, when they get an account, I say that you can see the results for the form. But you're not an editor. You don't go editing other pages or even editing the web form. Now I have one selector, actually the head of our e-resources department, which is an enormous wing, and that person wanted to have the power to edit the form. I trusted them, and they had the technical skill to do it. So I gave them another role. So they are, again, not allowed to edit the whole site, but they are allowed to edit forms. One caveat about this, I'm getting off the subject of submission access is who can submit, right? And so you choose which people can submit. So you could create a role and say only library staff are allowed to submit. And even with some advanced setup with LDAP, you could even assign that role when they are hired or move departments. with some really advanced LDAP stuff, which I haven't bothered to set up, but you could do that. So you could say only this people that are in this department can submit this form, right? So you could get that detailed, but it's a lot of work. So now I'm going on the roles beyond forms. You can also set up who can see the end. One thing about that, who can see and can't see a form, is it is global, right? So the Applebaum Award form, which is the prize, right? There's one person that gets the emails up at CSSSI, and she goes and looks at the results because she got the email. But if a selector were to wander over to that form, they would be able to see the results too. As far as I know, there is a module, but we don't even offer it. It's too much work. One thing I say a lot when I'm talking about roles and permissions is we're all adults here. You know, give people the power they need. If you give them a little bit extra, I mean, they work here. There's a certain level of professionality and competence we expect, so we don't think they're going to go wandering around editing other people's pages or looking at other people's submissions. And because of the things I talked about earlier, we're not collecting information that's that private. Anybody that works in the library can see who has something checked out at the time or who requested something. None of us go looking to see what our coworkers are looking at, asking for, you know. I see stuff, and I've seen some pretty controversial stuff requested. None of my business, you know. Really, none of my business what they're, if I see something really controversial, you know, from a controversial artist or photographer or writer, at that point I literally just look away from the name. I don't want to know who ordered it, you know, because you know. So we're all adults here. Okay. So the fun stuff. Results. Oh, I'm in the dev environment. Let's go live. And actually, I won't show you the, because of the stuff I just described, I will not show you the purchase request, just to be, just to make sure that one of those controversial ones doesn't pop up and somebody says, that I asked for a Mapplethorpe book? Who is that creep? You know, you know. So we will look at the results for something much more generic. In one tab, it's called results, and the other one's called submissions. Oh, this one isn't live yet. Let's look at a different one. That one's not open right now. Here we go. Oh, man, none of these have been filled out since we went live. We went live like 2 weeks ago, so apparently a lot of these haven't been filled out. I know this one. Am I on the live site? Okay. I know some of these have been filled out. I'm getting emails. What is going on? There we go. So we're going to go look at the. So in the purchase request, you can see all of the submissions that came in. You get internal information that was logged. So you get the date, you get the IP address they came from. This is because you actually don't see where they came from because of the setup of the server. Everything looks like it came from the local host. But you get their net ID or their username, and you can actually view the submission, right, and look at it the way it was submitted. As you asked before, you can edit these, but in general you don't. You don't edit these afterwards. Again, it's not a workflow. So I see the submission. I know who submitted it. I see, and you'll notice it's not putting in those back-end keys, those computer keys here. It is showing me the label, right, in this view, which makes it much easier to read the submission. And then you can do analysis. This is only useful if you're doing a survey. It's not very useful for this kind of thing. So far, all of the submissions since we went live, every single one of them, they've said it's because Yale doesn't own the item, right? And nobody has filled out any of the options, so it doesn't even show up. Then 14 people said, tell me whenever. Other people have said it's higher priority. Subject area, only 3 different subject areas have been chosen. I tell you, people just hit general and go with it. Right? And so this is more useful if you're doing some sort of survey where you need percentages or things like that. You can see the submissions as a table. This gets really wide as your form gets longer. So not very useful. But last but not least, if you are doing anything where you need to port it to a different system or do analysis on it and you don't want to do it in this tool, you can download the submissions. You can do it as delimited text, tabbed separated values, comma separated values. You can do it as a Microsoft Excel file, which is popular. You can tell it which type of delimiter you want. Then the selected options, you can tell it, show me the human name in the spreadsheet or show me the computer values in the spreadsheet. Right? So that's where you might want the raw data because you're moving it into some other system like a building code or an accounting code. You could have each select X'd on as a separate column in your spreadsheet and have X's for whether or not it was chosen. Or you can have a select list and then a comma delimited list inside of the column, depending on how you plan on using it. That can be very important choice to make, especially if you're going to move it into some other computer system that has to parse this. You can choose which things to export. Right? And this is really cool. You can download everything. Only since you last downloaded it, it actually remembers since you're logged in. You can only be logged in to see these. You can actually say, show me the one since I last downloaded this. You can set it to the last n number of submissions, 10 submissions, 20 submissions. Or you can say, give me the date range. So if you don't trust the show me the last downloaded ones, you can say, show me everything since last Monday, because I think that's the last time I downloaded things. Right? So you can show it by date range. Pretty cool. You know? So yes.
And if you select all submissions, it'll include all components if you check that for everything that you download.
Yeah. Yeah, so if you're doing something where it's a one-off and you know, like a prize or a survey and there's a limited time span, at the end you can download everything. Right? The other options are more useful for us are our purchase request forms because we have rolling purchase requests all year round and we don't want to download. This site's only been up for a couple weeks in the summer. We've already had 24 submissions, which is more than one a day. You should see what happens in the, you know, right at the beginning of the semester, beginning and end of the semester. Yeah, at the end of the semester, that's when the students have lost or damaged their books and they have to buy new ones. So, yeah, and they use that form for that too. So, I have paid for it. Please order it again. So, there is the nuclear option here. Clear. Don't do that. Don't do that. You probably shouldn't even look at that button. You know, click on that button, never mind the next one. I think it asks you one more time, are you sure you want to do this? But I've never had the only time I've had a reason to do this is when I was doing a survey or a prize submission and I was testing the form first. And then I cleared out the test submissions. But you can actually clear out the submissions one at a time. And unless you have a lot of tests, that's probably the safer way to do it. Yeah.
I used the clear button, but the first thing I did was to download it into Excel and save the Excel locally.
Yeah.
So if you do need to clear it, just make sure you have a backup.
Yeah, make a backup even if you don't, even if you don't think you'll ever need them again.
Right.
Make a backup. I'm going to stay in the basic area because we're having fun here, and you guys seem to be following along at the right pace. Because I forgot something. I forgot about that whole description above the top thing, which again is a primary issue. So you'll notice here, the description's down here. So when you fill out the description, which is the help text for this field, it ends up below the text area. And if people grab this and make it really long, or if you set it really long to start with, it might not even be on the screen, right? So a lot of people want it up here. How did he do that? Let me show you. Did he make that whole thing the label? Then what did the internal thing look like with all the underscores and things like that? No, I didn't. I mean, you could do that, but I would recommend not. What I did is there's a type called markup. right? Where you can put HTML into the form in between other elements. So it's not a form element in the sense that it will submit something. Just like a field set, it is a structural thing, right? So it doesn't have any, this never gets submitted and saved anywhere. It's just markup, HTML markup. And my convention, you'll notice my labels are all capitalized, but when I do markup, I lowercase them. That's purely my convention, but I found it useful. And so a markup field is really simple. You don't have all the options because this isn't going to get submitted. You get the label, then the key. The only difference is the underscore. And then you type in what you want, and then that's pretty much it. Now, you can add tokens. So if you have a person logged in, you could say, hey, username, you know, or things like that. Or, you know, today is such and such day. And you can, there's all kinds of tokens. I've never had a reason to do it, but you could customize the form based on what the computer knows about what's going on with the user and the day, time of day, and where it came from, and all kinds of things like that. I'm not even going to be able to get into. There's a way you can create the URL so that it passes information to the form to automatically get filled out before you even before the user even gets to starts filling it out. But that would all be done with tokens. And so that's your markup. And then what I did is that's the additional description. And then the additional information field, the actual form item, is a text area. And what I did there is I just set up a generic text area. Like I said, once you start doing these, you'll realize you're going to scroll down and ignore almost all of this, right? I hid the label so that now it looks like my description is the label. So that is a problem. I talked about APIs. The form API built deep into the core Drupal lays out label, input, description. Overriding it is you have to go way, way deep into the code. And so it is a known problem and a hotly debated issue. According to international usability standards, that's how you're supposed to do it, but everybody on the planet complains that I don't care about the standard, it doesn't work. You know, so it's a hotly debated issue, and there's a fairly simple workaround for now. I think in Drupal 8 they're finally giving you the option of saying where, element by element, you can say where to put the help text. They're finally saying that. Okay. Any questions? I'm already, actually, I'm getting very close to the end. So, any other questions? Yes.
I'm just trying to, in a broad sense, I'm familiar with Qualtrics, and primarily for servers. I haven't heard you talk about. I know that in Qualtrics you have a way you send surveys out. Start with a full panel, and who's responded. You then send the survey out to those that haven't responded from the full panel. Do you have any?
That is not built in. It could be done, but it would be. I'm not even sure how I would do that, to be honest. The only way you could do that with this is by taking your panel list, making them log in and collecting their net ID or email, downloading it, and then filtering what is, and then resending. So it would be a pretty ugly manual process. If Qualtrics has a better tool and that's all you need, then I have nothing against Qualtrics. We use it and I love it. If that's what you need foremost, then use Qualtrics. That is not functionality I've heard of in this. Some things that I won't, well, there are some things I can and can't get to. I talked briefly about tokens. There are ways that you can pre-fill certain form elements based on the environment that the form is being filled out in. You know, where the user came from, who the user is, other things. So you can add, you can fill out elements or change the markup or even change the path. You can do multi-page forms with Webform, although it's fairly rare. Even branching multi-page forms. But those are all one submission. It's not save it and do the rest later. So you can use tokens for that kind of thing. You can create all those option lists. You can create predefined lists in a module if you're going to use the same options over and over and over again, right? I have created a module that will actually be public, not just Yale internal, but that loads things like undergraduate, graduate, staff, faculty, because you use that all the time. So why would I keep filling out the options? So it's actually, there's a beta of it up on Drupal.org. We just have to get it into YaleSites, and then you can just say, instead of filling out the options, just give me the the affiliate type list. And so you can create predefined lists. Eventually, I'd like to work with them on lists of building codes and lists of accounting codes and other things that would be really useful. Under another one that freshman, sophomore, junior, senior. Why should we fill that over and over again? It's going to get asked a lot. So I'm working on it. And I made it public because none of the stuff I'm describing is internally, our major, the list of undergraduate majors is another one. So all of these things are publicly available information, so why not just make them into a list so that if another college wants undergraduate, if it wants freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, they can do it. One thing, and I do not know, this one might be one of the few things that I'm going to turn this on very briefly. Where is it closed? One thing that you can do, and I don't know, Qualtrics probably does this one, but if you have a select option, there's a thing called select or other. So these are actually the colleges. Again, here's another predefined list that I've created. So because this is going to be one that we're going to need more than once. And this is the predefined list. This is actually, even though it's in the list, is actually a separate element that's stored in a different place. So when I click on that, the other element shows up, right? So when you are creating these select lists I've talked about before, and you have a predefined list, you should always think, is there going to be a weird edge case when somebody doesn't, especially if you're making it required. If you're making it required, a select list required, you should almost always offer an other option. Because there's always going to be somebody that says, I don't fit into this box. And I can't fill out the form until I choose one of these, and I don't want to choose one of these, and they'll get annoyed and won't go away or yell at you or whatever. So you should. This is a module called Select or Other. I don't know if it's turned on by default. It is, yeah. And so when you are creating a select list, you can say Allow Other Option, and you can choose the label for Other, the other ... You can change it to something else.
This is built into Webform.
Is it now? Okay.
Oh, it's conditional.
I thought conditional was. I didn't know if this one was. So either way, when you're creating a select list, you can choose allow the other option, and then you can also say what the other field will look like to a limited extent. And so that's a really useful tool. I'm almost out of time. Any questions before I start showing the? Any other questions? Okay, so let me show you one more if I can. Is this the one? No, it's not back. There is a thing that will allow you to fill out a table. Right? It's somewhat limited. This is not. You can't add or remove rows. So actually, each of these is a separate storage area. But through the interface, you can create the table much more easily. And so that you have, when you need the payment, the payment may come from different funds, different grants or different things like that. And so they can fill in multiple codes, fill in multiple dollars, and I don't have to create, I don't know how many are there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 18. I don't have to create 18 fields. I create a table element. I tell it I want 6 rows, and I have to give the rows a label, which I've always given 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or whatever. And then I want these 3 elements, right? So I create a table, and I tell it I want 6 rows, just like I'm creating an option element, right? Because I do the same thing. I can have a label and a key value separate if I want. And then I have these 3 fields that I want in the table. And so I only create 4 things for 18 inputs, so it's a lot less work. And it displays a lot better. Mental note, even though I'm giving the fund code and the amount, it will not automatically calculate the percent. They asked for that. And no. So they do have to make sure that the one-time cost adds up. They do have to do that part by hand. This is not a spreadsheet after all. You know? I mean, if you really want to do that, go to Google Docs and create a form that has a spreadsheet behind it. There are tools for that kind of thing. So that's a neat element that I asked YaleSites to include because I was already using it. And then there's a thing, and I can't get into it very much, called conditional elements. This is the uber power where you can actually, let me show, I actually have a working one. The Apple Bomb, which I just turned on, right? This is one application. This prize, students can submit to the prize, but their advisors or faculty members or teachers can also submit their essays for them. So it says I'm a student submitting my own work, or I'm a student, or I'm submitting on behalf of a student, right? If I choose I'm a student, it asks for the initials of the student. If I choose I am submitting on behalf of a student, it asks for the submitter's name. 2 separate fields, both of which are required, but since I'm only showing one at a time, even though it's required, that won't blow up on me, right? When I submit this form, it'll say, if I submitted this form right now, it wouldn't say, hey, you didn't fill out the initials field. Because it knows I didn't show you the initials field, so I can't really expect you to have filled it out, right? Conditionals can be much more powerful than this. There's the ones that can allow for branching. So we have a multi-page form where you fill out a page, and then you could go to 2 different pages based on a condition that was submitted. So you can have a in-page conditional, and you can have a multi-page conditionals. You can have conditionals that do more complicated email things, right? Show this email instead of that. Conditionals are really powerful and really advanced, and I wish I had more time. Last but not least, you can add extra valence.